Hey guys, Joan Ribs here, coming at you with a Spire site chat. Today I want to talk about Spirelogs. This is going to be a little bit wordy and large and enormous. I want to make a video which I can send people to when they ask me stuff about Spirelogs, so that I don't have to make this explanation anymore, because it's a really long explanation, actually, which is why this video is going to be quite long. So I hope you enjoy it. Sorry if it's wordy. Some background. I have spent the last 15 years playing deck builders and roguelites at a very high level. I've played competitive Magic, I've played competitive poker at a level where I was able to do quite well for myself and make a living. I've played like Dominion and been top 10 in the world. I have played FTL, and my hard no pause streak is the second longest in the world. So Slay the Spire, being a deck-building roguelite, is a game that's very much right up my alley. I love this game, and I've put 1,500 hours into this game, and I currently hold world records in this game, and I'm like pretty good. I have a lot of valuable stuff to tell people about this game if they want to hear valuable stuff about this game. And at least once a day, I will be trying to impart value to other people by explaining things about this game to them, answering questions that they have about the game, whatever. And someone will say, hey, but Spirelogs. And it's really difficult for me to respond to the things that come next, because it's like a 20 or 30 minute explanation why what they're saying doesn't make sense. So let's see if I can get it all down. So Spirelogs is a really cool website. It's a community-made site for Slay the Spire statistics. Slay the Spire keeps data about the runs that you do in your Slay the Spire directory, and you can upload them here, and it will tell you all sorts of stuff about your own runs. So like, how much did you win, which cards performed best for you, which enemies killed you the most, stuff like that, if you want to just see what happened in your runs. And then Spirelogs goes one further, and this is where it starts to get a little bit problematic. It goes one further and starts trying to tell you things about everybody's runs. So Spirelogs has about 150,000 runs here, or something like that, stratified into non-Ascension, Ascensions 1 through 14, and Ascension 15 runs, and by Ironclad Silent Defect. And you can find out all sorts of fascinating information about what happened in those runs by reading many, many pages of lots and lots of data. And a lot of the data is conveyed in ways which are pretty cool and which I like. You can see which enemies dealt the most average damage to Ascension 15 defect runs over this population of run data, for example. The Automaton dealt the most average damage, and was also the enemy that Defect died to the highest percentage of the time that Defect fought the Automaton. Although the enemy that killed the Defect the most times was Gremlin Leader, because Defect fought Gremlin Leader more times than Defect fought Automaton. And so seeing stuff like that is like sort of cool. Like, okay, awesome. The problem is when you try to go from there to the hardest enemy in the game for Defect is Gremlin Leader, or the hardest enemy in the game for Defect is Automaton. That doesn't quite follow, because you're looking at data from people who are playing the game imperfectly and for all sorts of reasons, which I will continue to get into. But it just doesn't follow. It's not that easy, basically, to solve the game. You can't solve the game and work out who the hardest enemy for Defect to beat is by just collecting a bunch of runs and seeing what the average is. It's not how solving games works. Yeah, so you've got that going on, and then on top of that, Spirelogs actually gets sort of in your face and tries very deliberately to make claims about what the best things in the game are. So Spirelogs has these tier lists, which are created by combining the win rate and pick frequency of cards to give you a score for a card, and then it just rates the cards, highest to lowest. These are for silent, they're stratified into common, uncommon, and rare. I don't know why. for what it's worth. Like, why stratify them? It's unclear to me. But anyway, that's been done. And you have these, like, cards, and there are numbers next to them. And this is often my problem, is I'll be explaining for maybe a couple of minutes exactly how good bullet time is, or something like that. And then somebody comes back to me and says, hey, bullet time is scored 69 on Spirelogs. That implies that you're wrong. And it doesn't. It doesn't. And also, it's sort of like a waste of my time to have read somebody telling me what bullet time is rated on Spirelogs. So I really dislike this page. Some more background on me. I have studied statistics at a graduate level, and I have dealt a lot with trying to draw conclusions from very messy bodies of data. I wrote a paper about chess, and looked at how chess engines would recommend moves to human players which actually performed worse in practice for the human players than the moves that the players made. So, for example, I wrote an article showing how humans who were playing against opponents who were better than them were able to make moves which traded material off the board in chess, simplifying the position. And even if those moves were thought by chess engines to be somewhat worse than other moves, when the human players traded the material off, they performed better than the human players who didn't trade material off in comparable situations. I spent a very long time writing that article. It was very difficult. I studied graduate level statistics to make claims about it. I collected a lot of data and used like I had 10 computers running for weeks, and then in the actual data analysis stage, I was running some algorithms which required a 32 gigabyte RAM i7 computer to run overnight to complete stuff. So I have a fairly educated opinion about how difficult it is to make claims about data in games like this. It's something that I have actually done and studied. This is just not very good. What's being done here? It's not very successful at making claims about which cards are the strongest or most successful. And I'm gonna try to give you some examples because I don't expect you to just take my word for it. One thing that it's doing, which is problematic, is that it's extrapolating. So it's taking a body of data with 21.13% win rate on Ascension 15, or 25+% win rate on Silent and Defect. And it's trying to extrapolate from that data which cards are strongest. And we know at this point that people are currently winning more than 90% of their runs in this game. There are people who do that. I only know of 2. But I know that it is possible for people to be doing that. I happen to be one of those 2 people. So knowing that it's possible to be winning more than 90% of your runs, and then looking at data which is only winning 25% of its runs and trying to extrapolate on what the best decisions to make in the game are, is very, very difficult. That's the wrong thing to say. It is just straight up impossible. You just can't do that. Extrapolation is something that you can study at a very high level for a very long time and learn all sorts of things about extrapolation. There are ways that you can do extrapolation which are very valuable and do work. For example, we extrapolate the weather from the weather we're seeing on the globe right now. We can predict what the weather might be in a week, and we do that, and that's super valuable. I can look at the weather forecast in Studio City and see what the weather is going to be like a week from now, and this has a decent amount of accuracy to it. There are all sorts of ways that you can extrapolate, but the default thing to think about extrapolation is it's probably not something you want to do, and it's difficult to do, and it's likely to be inaccurate. So to give you some idea of how extrapolating works here, there's a time-honored statistical method here. If we have data and we're going to use some method to extrapolate some value. So our data is A15 runs on Spirelogs, right? And we're going to use a method score system to impart some value, and our value is which cards are best. We should be able to use the same thing to do something where we already know the value, which cards are best, like playing well, we'll say. So what we can do is we can take non-ascension runs. We'll use the same method, and the value that we want to predict in this case is something we already know. We're just testing whether this works or not. So we're going to take our non-ascension runs, use our score system, and try to predict the score of Ascension 15 runs. So again, the score of cards in Ascension 15 runs. So again, we're using our score system for some of this data to predict something of value to us. And in this case, we already know the thing of value that we're trying to predict, so we can see how well we do. And I've done this. I just looked at commons. I looked at commons with large enough sample sizes to be relevant according to Spirelogs. These are the non-ascension scores for cards, and then in the right column are the Ascension 15 scores for cards. And if we were good at extrapolating with this sort of method, we'd expect to see very, very similar, a very, very similar like distribution of scores between Ascension 0 and Ascension 15, but that's not what we see at all. What we see is that at Ascension 15, scores are by and large higher than they are at non-Ascension. We also see that at Ascension 15, some cards which scored relatively well at non-Ascension don't score very well at all, while some cards which scored relatively poorly at non-Ascension do score incredibly well. So for example, Flex at non-Ascension is the second best Ironclad common according to Spirelogs, and at Ascension 15, it is the second worst common. Now, there are all sorts of problems with what I'm doing here. Non-Ascension and Ascension 15 have a different rule set, for example. Like, the elites are tougher and stuff, so that could explain why Flex is better and Flex is worse at Ascension 15. But, like, honestly, the same can be said for the runs that I'm playing at Ascension 15 and the runs that the 25% win rate population is playing at Ascension 15. I fight far more elites at Ascension 15 than the population that we're looking at does. I take much different cards at Ascension 15 than the population that we're looking at in Ascension 15 does. I play fights better. I take less damage in those fights than the population at Ascension 15 would with the same cards and potions that I have. I use potions better. I use gold better. So when we're looking at the rule set for my Ascension 15 runs, the values of things are different in my runs from what they are in the like aggregate Ascension 15 run. And yeah, this is basically my experience with like reading the Ascension 15 tier list on Spirelogs and trying to extrapolate what a score might be for a card that I have in one of my runs. Like, a lot of the cards that I look at are like, wow, that score is really high for a card that just isn't that good. And then other ones are like, wow, that score is very low for a card which is actually pretty valuable. So, yeah, I don't know how convincing that was to you, but in general, from Ascension 0 runs, I'm able to predict like something like 30% of the variance that I see in Ascension 15 scores. And what this implies to me is that if you made a scoring list for my own runs, what you would see in general is that most of the scores would be higher than these are. And like many of the cards which scored low would have some of the highest scores, and some of the cards that scored high would have some of the lowest scores. And This is pretty in keeping with what I've seen when I've looked at my own data and runs. I'm not going to get into my own data and runs as well, because at some point there's too much going on in one video. There's already too much going on in one video. Okay, so there's extrapolation. I have some other general criticisms about Spirelogs stuff that's going on. The runs aren't all played in the same ways, so there's data from speedruns, data from runs which got abandoned early because someone didn't think that they had the deck that they needed to win, even if they did have a chance to win. There are runs where people were going for achievements or maybe meme decks or something like that instead of trying to win with the highest possible win rate. Another thing that's going on, which is pretty big, is that win rate is a terrible proxy for strength, and so is pick rate. This is a list composed of some aggregate of win rate of cards and pick rate of cards, and neither of those are very good predictors of strength of cards. So, for example, a low pick rate card, which is very good, could be bullet time for silent. Bullet time for silent is incredible if you have Snecko Eye, and if you don't have Snecko Eye, it's not that great. So it's a very strong card in the runs where you have Snecko Eye. The times that you take it, the times that you should take it, it will end up being really good, but a lot of the time you don't take it, because a lot of the time you're not in the situation where it is very strong. And this tier list claims, by caring about pick rate, that that means that bullet time isn't a very strong card. The fact that it isn't picked very often means that it isn't a strong card. There's no abstract run of Slay the Spire you will ever play. You're never going to sit down to play Slay the Spire and play an abstract run of it. You will always play a run where you actually have certain relics and actually have certain cards in your deck. And whether a card is strong or not depends on what's actually going on in the run. And if you have Snecko Eye as silent, bullet time's going to be fucking amazing. It will be very, very strong. And if you don't, it won't be that great. And that is what you actually need to know about this stuff to play the game well. This abstract evaluation of bullet time doesn't do anything. It has no value, really, to playing the game well. So that's why pick rate doesn't relate very well to a card's actual strength, and then why win rate wouldn't relate super well to a card's actual strength. So number one, some cards get picked up later on in a run than others. Backflip, for example, is a card which is not that great to add to your deck in the first half of a run, and is typically very good to add to your deck in the second half of a run. So you would expect Backflip to have a higher win rate than other cards which are good to add to your deck early in the run, because you start off a run at your lowest chance. Like, if you add a card to your deck on floor 1, it has floor 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the floors of the game remaining for it to have a chance to lose the run. If you add a card to your deck on floor 49, there's only one floor left for you to possibly lose the run on. So that card that you added to your deck on floor 49 is going to have a much higher win rate. So that's one reason that win rate is not a very good predictor of strength at all. Another reason is that some cards are added to decks when the deck already has a high chance to win and not added otherwise. So for example, on Defect, some of the synergistic cards with like focus stuff will get added to your deck when your deck's already very strong and won't get added otherwise. I think actually Bullet Time's another good example for Silent. This card will get added to your deck when you have Snecko Eye, which is already a really great decision or a really great situation, and won't get added as much otherwise. There are lots of reasons why win rate and pick rate do not do a very good job of relating to actual current strength of a card as you're going through a run. And keep in mind that a card can never be worse than Skip in this game, basically, unless you like transformed into it. If a card is worse than Skip, you just don't take it. And so Skip ends up being the worst possible value of a card in most situations. Data is collected from different patches of the game and treated as though largely nothing has changed, even though patches change things in this game. One of the biggest problems for this in Spirelogs is that patches have been significantly increasing win rates for the last several months. I have gone from a 50 to 60% win rate at Ascension 15 to a 90+% win rate at Ascension 15 without getting that much better at the game. I have obviously improved over playing the game for another 4 months at a very high level, but I haven't improved that much at the game. What's happened is that a lot of the enemies who used to be the most threatening enemies of the game have gotten nerfed and are now not very threatening at all. Chosen, Awakened One are two big examples there. A lot of the cards which were bad have been made better, and that has made the game significantly easier. Potions have been changed, so at Ascension 11, potions used to get weaker, but you could still get 3 of them. Now at Ascension 11, potions remain the same strength, but you can only hold 2 of them at once. That made the game a lot easier. So there are lots of reasons why the game has gotten a lot easier recently, and if you look at I mean, this is true for the tier list as well, but if you look at like win rates for relics, there are some recent relics which do incredibly well, and I think a significant reason for this is that the runs that have been played with those recent relics have been recent runs, and recent runs have a higher win rate. There's also probably something to be said for like Spirelogs population, like people who were losing a lot haven't uploaded runs this week or something. Like that's a thing that can happen because there's no control on the population at all. It's just self-reporting entirely. Card picks are treated as though they have the same opportunity cost but do not. Rares are unfairly undervalued because taking them often implies failing to get an even better rare from boss reward, for example. So your card picks in this game are not all the same value. Early card picks are very important to hit good cards off of. And like card picks from elites have higher chance of having rares at them, and card picks from act bosses are all rares. So if I am ever taking a nightmare in this game or a doppelganger or something like that, there's an implication, a fairly heavy implication, that the situation is that I'm in a fight where I was more likely to get a rare than usual, either because I was fighting an elite or I was fighting an act boss, and I didn't get one of the good rares. And that means that that card pick was pretty bad for me, compared to what it could be on average. So if I'm taking one of the less good rares, then After Image, Adrenaline, Malaise, 1000 Cuts, if I'm taking, oh my god, Burst is 6th? Some of these numbers are just fucking weird. Tools of the Trade is 7th. Yeah, I don't know. Some of these numbers are so weird. Anyway, there's an implication there that I just missed out on something that could have been very valuable to me in the run, and so my win rate should take a little bit of a hit for that. And so you'd expect a lot of the rare cards to be unfairly lower win rate compared to, like, commons are not getting placed up in situations where you're expecting as much value out of your card pick. By the way, like, there's no, like, you can get offered upgraded cards in this game, and there's just absolutely no acknowledgement of that in this list. Like, how good is upgraded backflip versus regular backflip? I don't know. Typically I assume that prepared does well because, like, okay, it's low pick rate because nobody takes unupgraded prepared, but then it does pretty well because when people do pick up prepared, it is always the upgraded one, but I don't know. Like, that's not actually conveyed to me here. Okay, the population is not impartially sampled from. Self-reporting leads to things like 5% of the Ascension 15 silent runs being from the same player. This is good for describing how that player plays, but not good for inferring how to best play. This is a real thing. Like, the people who have submitted the largest number of runs to Spirelogs are composing up to 5% of a population of Ascension 15 runs on their own. And that's, you know, pretty problematic for having impartial data about what playing the game is like, because a lot of your data is describing how one specific player plays the game rather than how a general population plays the game. If you're looking at a population in statistics, I'm going back to weather again because it's just a very simple example. If you're looking at a desert and the temperature in the desert is either cold at night or warm during the day and there's very little in between, like there's dawn and dusk where it crosses over, but generally it's either hot or cold. If you're not successfully sampling from all of the different temperatures you can get really stupid numbers. If you only sample during the day, for example, you're going to learn that the desert is always hot. And that's not right, because the desert's cold at night, but you only sample during the day. And that can happen when you're letting people self-report runs. You can very easily end up getting a ton of runs from people. People may be reporting runs where they won and not reporting ones where they lost. That's the thing to be concerned about. There is absolutely no claim by Spirelogs that you shouldn't do that. By the way, like, say that somebody wanted to collect the runs that they had won on Spirelogs so that they could look and see what their winning runs shared in common. That would be a reasonable thing for a person to use Spirelogs as a tool to do. There is nothing on Spirelogs that ever says that you shouldn't do that, and yet the data in aggregate is being presented as though the runs are representative runs. Even though it's very reasonable that somebody might only be uploading their wins, very reasonable that people are uploading runs which they abandoned on floor 3 because they had to go take the dog out or something. Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to touch on here is that it really does matter what metric you're reporting. Looking at weather again, this is, again, how we're reporting weather to people, and this has a lot of value, right? You see what the current temperature is, you see what the temperature is going to be, you know what humidity and wind speed are, and what the chance of it raining is, you see whether there's cloud cover. This is all very valuable to a person to see. If we just described the average temperature, and that's what a person saw, it said Studio City, Los Angeles, California, 80. That would have some value, but it would have a lot less value. If you did that for a desert, it would be particularly silly. Like, so let's say that this is around about 50 and this is around about 90. They're telling you that the average temperature is 70. So what are you meant to do? Like, you show up dressed for 70-degree weather and then you're just constantly either freezing cold or burning hot. So making sure that you describe data in a valuable way is pretty important. And yeah, I don't, like, this number I would not describe as a valuable way. A way that I could imagine describing Cloak and Dagger in a valuable way is you try to create a profile of it and you say, hey, Cloak and Dagger is best when picked in Act 1 or Act 3 or something, and Cloak and Dagger is very good at beating these elite fights. Decks with Cloak and Dagger in them do better against these elite fights. And Cloak and Dagger is good with these relics. These are the relics which do the best with Cloak and Dagger in the deck relative to other things. And you could make some sort of profile of a card which had some sort of interesting value. Although, again, you're running into inferring things about how to play the game well from data, which has all of the problems we've been talking about. Player-perceived metagame implies how cards will perform. If players think poison builds on Silent are best, they will try to build these, and poison cards will win, say, 60% of the time, while non-poison cards may do worse than that. But with proper play, those non-poison cards might have been able to be winning more than 60% of the time. So, a lot of the conversation about Silent has pretty much always been about, like, Silent's really good at blocking and really good at getting a lot of damage out of powers like Noxious Fumes. There's also a lot of conversation about how Silent has very powerful poison cards like Catalyst. And so there's a way to deal a lot of damage by combining Deadly Poison and Catalyst together. If these conversations happen between people and people try to play Silent with this strategy and then upload data showing how they played Silent with this strategy, you're not looking at data about how to play Silent well at all. You're looking at data about how people have discussed a way to play Silent which they think is the norm, and then they're doing it, and you're looking at data about how well that performed. And that just doesn't have anywhere near as much value in terms of determining the best way to play the game. This is something that, like, I have always felt about this stuff. There are so many people talking about, like, you build this archetype of deck and that's the way to win and stuff, and look, I build this archetype of deck and it lets me win 50% of the time or whatever, and you're shortcutting like half the game, which is working out how to actually build a deck for the unique run that you're in. And you're also focusing on one strategy instead of other strategies which are going to be better for certain situations, and that style of playing the game just doesn't win as much as playing the game like perfectly would. It handicaps you, and that's a thing that this data is catching, like people doing that and then uploading their stuff. And then this is sort of a big one, I think. Spirelogs inaccuracies are self-reinforcing, as in players take inaccurate information from Spirelogs, and then they think that it contains value and authority, so they try to inform their gameplay from it. And then after they teach themselves how to play the game from Spirelogs, those very players who are most influenced by the data about how to play the game from Spirelogs are going to be ones who turn around and upload their own runs back to Spirelogs. And then Spirelogs gets a bunch of data about how people who are playing the game according to how Spirelogs thinks you should play the game are doing, which is, fairly likely to coincide with what Spirelogs already said you should do in terms of playing the game. So you get stuck in this cycle where Spirelogs says footwork and well-laid plans and leg sweep and noxious fumes are the best silent uncommons, which in this case I actually think that that's fairly accurate for what it's worth. Those are all really strong uncommons. And then people are like, okay, so I'm going to play decks which use those cards, and then they just try to build that deck over and over again. And when they get it, they do well, and they upload their runs, and the values of those cards go up more. But when they don't get it, and they were meant to build a different sort of deck, and there are different sorts of decks which do well. Where's Skewer here? Skewer, Flechette's Finisher. These are cards which do a lot of damage too. Catalyst is a card which deals a lot of damage. Where's Catalyst? Catalyst can deal a lot of damage. I mean, just having a Deadly Poison and some block cards can be enough to win a run. I won a run that was largely about that the other day. When they're put in that situation, they're not understanding as well how to win the run, and they're losing instead of winning. And then those cards are not having as high a score. I think that Noxious Fumes, Caltrops, and 1,000 Cuts are roughly equivalent in value for Silent. I think that all three of those are powers which create scaling damage in a way that applies fairly comparably to most of the relevant fights in the game. And if I think that all of those cards should be valued the same in this tier list, and that's what the tier list should truly be portraying, it is very, very easy for me to look at this tier list and say, I see no possible way that it could correct itself. Because a bunch of players are going to come to this tier list, they're going to see the tier list, they're going to see that Noxious Fumes is scored 219, Caltrops is scored 90. They're not going to take Caltrops, they are going to take Noxious Fumes. This tier list rates cards based on how often they were taken. So Noxious Fumes is continuing to be rated very highly because it's the one that gets taken a lot, and Caltrops is not taken very often. And then the tier list basically stays the same. It doesn't correct. It's a reinforcing loop. So, oh my god, this has been a long video. What ways are there to do this properly? Because I don't want to just be like, hey, this isn't right, and then like leave you there. Because there are ways that people approach these problems in the world. So there's methodology and statistics which tries to do this stuff like in ways that which do impart value. Something that you can do when you have very messy data and like you're not getting good samples and there may be some biases going on in collection, stuff like that, is that you can use something called matching analysis, for example. And this is something that I have used in the past. Matching analysis is pretty messy in itself, and it's not super accepted in statistics yet. It's still pretty like cutting edge, but the basic idea is you start at the tried and tested double-blind study. So if you're trying to work out if a medicine works, you take 100 people and give them the medicine, and another 100 people and give them a placebo, which they think is the medicine, but which doesn't actually have an effect. And then you come back and see what's happened. That's like the general inferential statistical study in order to try to work out if a treatment works. And you try to use matching analysis to create a study like that for this game. So in our matching analysis, we could say that getting Glacier was the treatment. And what we'd do is we'd look at all of the runs for Defect which got Glacier, and all of the runs for Defect which didn't get Glacier, and would try to match like 100 which did with 100 which didn't. So we take like, which floor is it on? What other cards are in the deck? How much gold do you have right now? How much health do you have right now? What's the overall win rate of the player? You take all of these sorts of variables and you try to find runs which have similar variables, but one of them did get Glacier and one of them didn't get Glacier, and you match them together. And you do an analysis and see if your treatment and control group seem to be similar enough. Like, are we actually succeeding in matching these runs in a way which looks sensible? And if you look at your analysis and you see, oh yeah, like, this is a run where on floor 13, the player had Ball Lightning, 60 health, 100 gold, and got a Glacier, and this is a run where on floor 12, the player had Ball Lightning, 120 gold, 50 health, and got Glacier. These runs are pretty similar. You can go ahead and analyze that as though it's a double-blind study and see what happens to the runs which get the treatment of Glacier and what happens to the runs which don't. And that can try to impart value by telling you like how much Glacier was doing. This is like the way that one of the ways that statisticians would try to approach this problem right now. That's the level of like difficulty and work that goes into trying to smooth out how much noise is in these variables. Just to like give you some idea of how much work would actually have to go in to start to make claims that Spirelogs is sort of like casually claiming without doing any of that work. And this is some of the reason why the claims that Spirelogs is making don't make any sense a lot of the time. There are problems with this. This would only comment on the value of Glacier for our population. It wouldn't comment on the value of Glacier abstractly for the entire game. It's only telling you whether Glacier helps the people who are playing these games win or not. There's quite a lot of processing power going on, and there's still quite a lot of error. This is not a fully accepted method for statistics yet. It's very complicated to calculate the significance of data which is analyzed like this and stuff like that. This was like 4 years ago or something that I was studying this, and I haven't actually checked in with it again, so I don't know what people think about matching analysis at the moment, 4 years later. But in general, statistics has some advanced methodology for dealing with messy sets of data, which you can learn and implement, or you can hire a statistician to try to do it. You can also write a Slay the Spire engine and get it to a point where it has high win rates. This is something that was done for chess, right? So chess for the last 20 years or so, 15 years, the best players in the world have been computer engines. And when one of the best human players in the world wants to learn more about a certain position in chess, they'll often spend some time, either themselves or somebody in their team whose job it is to analyze a position, will spend a time with a chess engine and be running numbers and looking at what the engine would do in certain situations and stuff like that. And so there are some definite pros with doing something like that. The engine is going to be its own authority, because it's like effectively a very, very, very good player of the game, possibly the best player in the game, possibly the best player in the world of the game. The engine can be used by anybody to analyze their runs. The engine's going to be impartial and will give the same answers to everybody, no matter what the situation, no matter who's asking. And the engine can actually impart more value to humans about how to play the game. You can make an engine which is greater than the sum of its parts. So even if you don't understand how to play Slay the Spire better than anybody else in the world, you can create an engine which, by looking at all of the inputs that you give it, will start playing Slay the Spire better than anybody else in the world. There are cons to making an engine, which are mainly that it's very difficult. It takes a long time to make an engine like this, and then the engine can't communicate why it's doing something to players. So getting the value out of the engine once it's at a point where it's very, very good can actually still be somewhat difficult, because you have to try to justify why it's doing this thing which you don't understand very well. And another thing that people might do to solve this problem right now would be to have a neural network learn Slay the Spire. And I don't know that much about neural networks, but neural networks are like the next thing after engines. And basically how a game engine would work would be that you would give it a bunch of inputs and tell it how important different things were, and then it would calculate from there what to do. Whereas a neural network, you're not holding its hand quite as much, but you're using a lot of processing power to let it learn on its own what's more important. That's my very, probably quite poor summary of what a neural network does. But these are things which you could do to accomplish what we're talking about, and they're not that easy. They're just not that easy. This problem that we're talking about is not that easy to solve. So, yeah, that's what I had to say about Spirelogs. I hope this was interesting to you. This is something that I find fascinating. I find it immensely banal to explain once a day to somebody why I don't give a fuck that a card that I'm talking about has a score of 100 on Spirelogs. I just could not care in the slightest and do not think it means anything really. But in general, the data for Slay the Spire getting collected is really cool, and in general, the problem of trying to take messy data like this and impart value to people is really cool. And I hope that this continues to get developed, but for right now, this is my response. If somebody comes to me and asks me why I'm saying something that doesn't agree with Spirelogs, Spirelogs, there's no reason that somebody playing the game at a high level would have opinions that agreed with Spirelogs. It's just not, there's just no reason why that would happen, really. So, thanks for tuning in, guys, and I will see you tomorrow for a more normal Spire side chat. Hope you've enjoyed. Bye-bye.